Devrin Brooks and his partner Alyssa Harmon had spent years working tirelessly, saving every penny for a fresh start in a new city. They were determined to build a better life together. But that dream came crashing down when Alyssa vanished, taking all their savings with her. Devrin Brooks, a 26-year-old man from East Kansas City, had always been a hard worker. From a young age, he understood the value of perseverance and determination. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he learned early on that nothing comes easy. Devrin was focused, often spending long hours at his job as a mechanic at Metro Tires. His life wasn't glamorous, but he made it work. His partner, 24-year-old Alyssa Harmon, was equally hard-working. She worked as a cashier at Dollar World, doing her part to support their shared goals. Devrin and Alyssa were childhood sweethearts, having been together since high school. They had a quiet, focused relationship with little time for distractions. Their friends often described them as a couple driven by a common vision, rarely socializing, and constantly working toward a future they both envisioned. They weren't ones for extravagance. They simply worked, saved, and dreamed. Their lives were modest, but they had a clear goal in mind: to leave Kansas City behind and build a new life together in Austin, Texas. It wasn't just about escaping their surroundings, it was about the promise of a fresh start, of starting over in a place where they could grow both personally and professionally. Together, they dreamed of a future free from the constraints of their past, where they could thrive and build something meaningful. Their saving strategy was simple but effective. They lived frugally, cutting back on unnecessary expenses and putting every extra dollar they could into their savings. They had no lavish nights out or fancy purchases. Everything went into the goal of relocating to Austin. They worked tirelessly, Alyssa on the morning shift at Dollar World, Devrin at the tire shop, and over time they accumulated $14,300. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to get them started. They had visions of a better life, of new opportunities, new adventures, and, most importantly, the freedom to live on their own terms. The morning of July 3, 2023, started just like any other for Devrin and Alyssa. Alyssa left their shared apartment around 7:40 a.m., dressed in her usual work uniform, carrying her shoulder bag. Devrin had no reason to suspect that this morning would be any different from the countless mornings they had spent together. He assumed she was simply heading to her shift at Dollar World, just as she had done many times before. But when he tried to contact her later that afternoon, things took an unexpected turn. By 1 p.m., Devrin became concerned. He had sent Alyssa a text during his lunch break, but hadn't received a response. It wasn't unusual for her to be busy, but when calls to her phone went straight to voicemail, Devrin's anxiety grew. Something didn't feel right. He checked the time again, trying to rationalize the situation, but with every passing minute, his worry only deepened. His mind raced, and he found himself pacing around the apartment, unsure of what to do next. He waited for her to call back, but there was no sign of Alyssa. Unable to shake the uneasy feeling, Devrin decided to call her workplace to check if she had arrived for her shift. When the manager informed him that Alyssa had never shown up, a sinking feeling gripped his chest. Devrin immediately knew something was wrong. It wasn't like Alyssa to just disappear. They had been building their future together. She wouldn't just walk away from everything they had worked for. With growing panic, Devrin filed a missing person report with the Kansas City Police Department later that evening. His mind was overwhelmed with questions, none of which had answers. Where could she be? Why hadn't she reached out? The uncertainty was agonizing. He knew he couldn't sit idly by, so he launched into action. Devrin began searching their apartment and the surrounding neighborhood, hoping to find some sign of where Alyssa had gone. He posted flyers around the area and shared details of her disappearance on social media, urging anyone who might have seen something to come forward. Still, the sense of helplessness persisted. Devrin contacted local hospitals, hoping to find some trace of her, but there was no sign of Alyssa anywhere. It felt as if she had vanished into thin air. Despite his efforts, nothing seemed to bring him any closer to the answers he so desperately needed. The days stretched on with no word from Alyssa. A key piece of the mystery came when Devrin began looking through the apartment for clues. His heart sank as he noticed Alyssa's belongings were gone. Her ID, makeup kit, and overnight bag were missing. The side of the closet where she kept her clothes had been partially emptied. Some of her favorite items, the ones she wore most often, were nowhere to be found. The bed, where they had spent countless nights planning their future, seemed unusually empty. It was clear that Alyssa had taken some of her things, but it didn't add up. Why would she leave in such a rushed manner? If she was planning to disappear, why leave so many personal items behind? There were no signs of a struggle in the apartment, no broken doors or windows, no evidence that anyone had forced their way inside. Everything appeared undisturbed, almost too calm for a situation involving a missing person. This detail left the police with more questions than answers. At first, the authorities treated the case as a possible voluntary disappearance. After all, Alyssa had the means to leave if she wanted to. She was an adult, and her relationship with Devrin hadn't been marked by any known conflicts. Still, there was something about the situation that didn't quite fit. Devrin, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary disappearance. He was certain that Alyssa wouldn't leave without saying something, especially when everything they had worked for was so close to becoming reality. Their shared dream of starting a new life in Austin was within reach, and Alyssa was fully invested in that future. She wouldn't have just walked away from it. As the investigation began, the police found little to go on at first. Alyssa's phone records showed that she had received no messages or calls after leaving for work that morning. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses didn't reveal anything out of the ordinary. The initial assumption was that Alyssa had voluntarily left, perhaps after a spontaneous decision to leave town or go somewhere else. The police kept the case open, treating it as a missing persons case that could be resolved quickly once Alyssa chose to come home. For Devrin, the first few days after her disappearance felt like an eternity. His mind kept racing back to the times they spent talking about their plans for Austin, the future they had dreamed of together. He couldn't believe she would simply walk away from it all. Still, he had no concrete evidence to suggest anything else. He pushed ahead with his search, continuing to put up flyers and reaching out to friends and family, hoping someone knew something. But with each passing day, the feeling of helplessness only deepened. As the timeline of Alyssa's disappearance continued to unfold, Devrin's concern grew. She had left in the morning, and by noon she was unreachable. When he looked back at the morning she disappeared, everything seemed so normal. There had been no indication, no warning signs, that anything out of the ordinary would happen. It wasn't until later that day, when Devrin filed the missing person report, that the gravity of the situation started to fully settle in. The search for Alyssa had only just begun, but already he knew something was terribly wrong. On July 10, 2023, just a week after Alyssa's disappearance, Devrin received an alarming notification from Kansas Trust. The alert told him that a large withdrawal of $9,800 had been made from Alyssa's account. The transaction had occurred in Springfield, Missouri, a place far from their apartment in Kansas City. Devrin was immediately taken aback. He knew Alyssa hadn't made that withdrawal. She didn't have access to that kind of money on her own. The notification sent a wave of dread over him. What had started as a missing persons case now seemed to be spiraling into something far more serious. How could she have accessed the account without anyone noticing? And if Alyssa was missing, who was making these transactions? As Devrin checked the details of the withdrawal, his suspicion turned into outright panic. The withdrawal had come from an ATM near a motel in Springfield. This was no coincidence. Someone else was clearly using Alyssa's card. Devrin felt a growing sense of betrayal. The woman he had trusted with his future, the woman he had worked alongside to build a better life, was now connected to something dark. Could Alyssa really be involved in fraud, or was someone else pulling the strings? The fear only grew stronger when a second fraudulent withdrawal took place 2 days later, on July 12. This time it was for $3,000, and it had been made in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Devrin was now certain that this was no simple disappearance. Someone was using Alyssa's card, moving large sums of money across multiple states, and it wasn't Alyssa herself. Whoever was behind these actions was not only taking her money but also manipulating the situation. The police, already involved in the missing persons case, were immediately alerted to the fraudulent withdrawals. They began to focus their investigation on the financial aspect of the crime. Devrin was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. If Alyssa wasn't behind the transactions, she may have been coerced or worse, involved in a larger criminal activity. But Devrin held on to the hope that, somehow, Alyssa was still the victim, not the perpetrator. The investigation into the fraudulent withdrawals soon took a new and disturbing turn. With help from Kansas Trust, law enforcement traced the second transaction back to a motel in Springfield. The name on the reservation was not Alyssa's, but instead Sandra H. Lewis, a false identity. This new detail caused Devrin's heart to sink further. The motel room had been rented under a fake name. Something didn't sit right. Could Alyssa have been trying to hide her tracks? Or was she involved in something more than he had imagined? The investigation revealed that Alyssa had indeed stayed at the motel for 2 nights, from July 10 to July 12, the exact dates of the fraudulent withdrawals. The police gathered surveillance footage from the motel, hoping it might shed light on Alyssa's movements. What they discovered on the footage left Devrin stunned. It wasn't just Alyssa walking out of the motel room. She was accompanied by a man. The two of them left the motel together, walking side by side as if they had been planning the departure for some time. Devrin's stomach dropped when he saw the man's face on the footage. It was Remel Jenkins, Alyssa's maternal uncle. Devrin knew him well enough. Jenkins had recently been released from prison, and Devrin had always expressed concerns about his influence over Alyssa. Jenkins had a history of criminal activity, but Devrin had never expected him to be involved in something like this. Alyssa had told him that Jenkins was a bad influence, but Devrin never imagined he would be part of something so devious. Devrin's mind raced. How long had Alyssa been in contact with Jenkins? Was he the one who had convinced her to leave? Had he manipulated her into taking that large sum of money? It wasn't clear yet, but the police were starting to form a clearer picture. Alyssa had, at some point, been in contact with Jenkins, likely for a longer period than Devrin had been aware. The footage revealed that Alyssa didn't just leave willingly, there was something premeditated about it. She had withdrawn the money and taken off with Jenkins, who had used his influence over her to orchestrate the plan. The idea that Alyssa might have been coerced into participating in this fraud made Devrin question everything. Could Alyssa have been involved willingly, or had she been manipulated into taking part in a scheme that spiraled out of her control? Devrin was shaken to his core, torn between the woman he loved and the realization that someone he trusted might have been leading her down a dangerous path. As the investigation deepened, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary case of someone leaving to start a new life. This was something much darker, and Alyssa, whether a willing participant or not, had been caught in the middle. The investigation into Alyssa's disappearance took a more startling turn when the police uncovered a crucial piece of evidence: a draft in Alyssa's mobile phone. It wasn't a completed message, but a note that, once found, sent a cold shiver through the investigation. The note read, "Remel will pick me up at the exit. Everything will be quick."
These words struck Devrin like a blow to the chest. Alyssa, the woman he loved and had been planning a future with, had been writing down plans for her own disappearance, with the help of someone he had always been wary of, her uncle Remel Jenkins. The discovery of this note confirmed something Devrin had feared. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision or a voluntary walkaway. This was a premeditated plan, carefully orchestrated between Alyssa and Jenkins. Alyssa had been preparing to leave, and from the looks of it, she was going to do so with a significant sum of money that wasn't rightfully hers. The realization hit hard. The woman who had been his partner, his confidant, had been planning her disappearance for weeks, if not months. As the note became central to the case, it painted a chilling picture. Alyssa's plan wasn't just about leaving Devrin, it was about staging her departure, taking the money, and making sure that their savings, which had been the foundation of their new life in Austin, went with her. She had thought ahead, withdrawing money in strategic amounts and under aliases to make sure the account wouldn't be flagged immediately. The withdrawal of $9,800 from Springfield and the subsequent $3,000 from Tulsa seemed like the beginning of a larger plan to cover her tracks. She was executing a scheme to steal and escape without a trace, but not without some level of hesitation. Alyssa's meticulous planning became clearer as investigators dug deeper. The note not only indicated that she was working with Jenkins but also revealed how much thought had gone into staging her disappearance. It wasn't an impulsive decision, this was a strategy. The choice of fake names, the use of motels to avoid detection, and the withdrawal of cash in specific locations all pointed to the same conclusion. Alyssa was intentionally trying to disappear. She wasn't just leaving to start a new life, she was actively removing herself from any traceable connections, with the clear intention of leaving behind her past and Devrin without looking back. The plan to withdraw the money before the account was frozen indicated a deep level of forethought. Alyssa knew that once the missing person report was filed, her accounts would be flagged. She had to act quickly, taking the money and making sure the funds were used before anyone had a chance to stop her. It was as if she had anticipated every step, even down to the use of a false name to rent the motel room. Sandra H. Lewis was a completely fabricated identity, someone who didn't exist, someone who could easily be erased once the withdrawal was made and the plan was executed. It was clear to the police now that this wasn't just a case of a missing woman, this was a case of financial theft, carefully orchestrated and executed by Alyssa herself, in collaboration with Remel Jenkins. The thought that Alyssa, who had been part of Devrin's life for so long, could be involved in something so cold and calculated was a bitter pill for him to swallow. This wasn't just a break from their relationship. It was a betrayal that cut much deeper. The police investigation revealed that Alyssa had been more than just an accomplice. She had played a central role in the fraud. As they combed through her financial records, they discovered a series of transactions, all pointing to an elaborate deception. Alyssa had stolen money, used multiple aliases, and planned her disappearance for weeks. The fraudulent withdrawals were only part of a much larger scheme, one that had involved her working with Jenkins to carry out a sophisticated financial crime. But there was another layer to this: Alyssa's apparent reluctance. In addition to the note, the police uncovered texts and other drafts on her phone that revealed Alyssa's inner turmoil. While she had gone along with the plan, there was evidence that she was not entirely comfortable with the idea of leaving everything behind. In one message she wrote, "I feel so guilty. What if we get caught? What if I can't come back?" These moments of doubt suggested that Alyssa wasn't entirely confident in what she was doing. The realization that she was being manipulated by Jenkins became clearer. While she may have been complicit in the fraud, it seemed that Jenkins had played a much larger role in influencing her decision-making. Alyssa's complicated feelings were evident throughout the investigation. In one final, desperate text to a friend, she expressed fear about what would happen after the money was taken. "I'm scared, but it's too late now." This last message raised questions about how much control she had in the situation and whether she had been coerced or manipulated by Jenkins into participating in the crime. The authorities now began to shift their focus. While Alyssa had voluntarily participated in the fraudulent activity, it was becoming clear that she might have been more of a pawn in Jenkins' scheme than an active partner. Alyssa's fear, expressed in her drafts and messages, pointed to the idea that she was not entirely in control of the situation. The police were now considering the possibility that while Alyssa had made the choice to disappear, it wasn't entirely of her own volition. Jenkins, with his history of criminal behavior, had likely taken advantage of her, leading her into a situation that spiraled beyond her control. As the investigation progressed, the case began to take a darker turn. The first significant breakthrough came when a team of investigators searched a remote cabin in Shawnee, Oklahoma. Shawnee, located on the outskirts of Oklahoma City, had become a focal point in the investigation after it was revealed that Alyssa had been in the area. The discovery of several discarded personal items raised more questions. Among the items found were a burned cell phone, several of Alyssa's personal belongings, and a torn-up receipt that appeared to have been hastily discarded. The burned phone was especially troubling. When forensic experts analyzed the phone, they found that it had been intentionally destroyed, likely to prevent any tracking of Alyssa's movements or communications. This indicated a premeditated effort to cover up her whereabouts, which shifted the investigation's focus. What was initially assumed to be a disappearance motivated by personal issues now appeared to involve far more serious criminal activity. The presence of Alyssa's personal items and the deliberate destruction of evidence suggested that she had been at the cabin, but it wasn't clear under what circumstances. With each new piece of evidence, the picture became more complicated. Investigators began to theorize that Alyssa's decision to leave might have been driven by a growing sense of regret. Some of the texts and notes that had been uncovered in earlier phases of the investigation indicated that she had been wavering in her commitment to the plan. Could it be that Alyssa had changed her mind, wanted to return to Devrin, and that her attempts to leave the situation had led to tragic consequences? At this point, the case began to shift. What was once a missing persons case had now taken on the appearance of a potential abduction or even homicide. The new evidence suggested that Alyssa's departure had not been a clean break, but rather part of a struggle, possibly involving coercion or manipulation. This idea was reinforced by the discovery of her belongings in Shawnee. Alyssa had been there, but for how long and under whose control? The prime suspect was now clearly Remel Jenkins. Alyssa's uncle had been closely involved in the events surrounding her disappearance, and the police began to focus their efforts on tracking him down. With his criminal history, including convictions for fraud and identity theft, Jenkins became the central figure in a growing web of deception. His criminal behavior and his influence over Alyssa were now at the heart of the investigation. Jenkins' role in this tragedy became clearer with every lead. His ability to manipulate Alyssa, combined with his own criminal inclinations, painted him as the person most likely responsible for pushing Alyssa into a dangerous situation. He had been seen with her at the motel, and now, with the discovery of the burned phone and the evidence of her presence in Shawnee, he appeared to be the one pulling the strings. The possibility of him being involved in Alyssa's death was now under serious consideration. On July 24, 2023, nearly 3 weeks after Alyssa's disappearance, the search came to a heartbreaking conclusion. A group of investigators, following a tip from a local resident, discovered the remains of Alyssa near the Canadian River in Oklahoma. The discovery was made in a remote area, where the land was sparsely populated and often overlooked by travelers. The moment they confirmed the identity of the body, Devrin's worst fears were realized. Alyssa was dead. Forensics determined that she had been strangled, her life taken away in an act of brutality. The physical evidence on her body matched the timeline of her disappearance. She had been killed shortly after leaving Shawnee, Oklahoma. The discovery of her remains shifted the case into an entirely new phase. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. Alyssa had been murdered, and the police were now determined to find out who was responsible. The timeline of her death matched the period immediately following her disappearance from Shawnee, suggesting that her life ended in a violent confrontation. The authorities speculated that Alyssa had either attempted to break away from Jenkins and the plan they had set in motion or had been betrayed by him after she had second thoughts about the scheme. The toxic nature of Jenkins' influence over her seemed to have led to a tragic and irreversible point. Jenkins' actions after the murder only added to the suspicions surrounding his involvement. After Alyssa's death, Jenkins continued to make fraudulent withdrawals from her accounts, using multiple aliases to cover his tracks. His desperate attempts to evade capture were indicative of his guilt. He had already shown a propensity for fraud, and his continued use of Alyssa's identity following her murder made it clear that he was trying to maintain control over the situation. Each withdrawal he made seemed like a step further into his own web of deceit. The investigation revealed that, in the days following Alyssa's murder, Jenkins had used at least 4 different identities to access her bank accounts. He withdrew thousands of dollars, attempting to cover his tracks and flee the state. His behavior became increasingly erratic as he moved from one city to another, using various names and documents to hide his involvement in Alyssa's death. At the same time, Devrin was left with the unbearable weight of knowing that his partner was gone, and that the person responsible for her death was someone close to her. Alyssa had always been wary of her uncle's influence, but she had never fully realized how far Jenkins would go to exploit her trust. The discovery of Jenkins' continued actions in the wake of Alyssa's death reinforced his role as the orchestrator of this tragedy. As Jenkins evaded capture, the police intensified their search. They pieced together his movements, tracking him across state lines, but he was constantly one step ahead, using false identities to hide his whereabouts. The more they learned about his methods, the clearer it became that Jenkins had been manipulating Alyssa for a long time. But despite his efforts to evade capture, Jenkins couldn't hide forever. The investigation was gaining traction, and the evidence was beginning to mount. Devrin, who had been following the case closely, felt a mixture of anger and sadness as the authorities closed in on the man responsible for taking Alyssa from him. The moment Devrin learned of Alyssa's tragic fate, his world was shattered. For weeks, he had clung to the hope that Alyssa would return. He believed, despite the growing evidence of betrayal, that she had been manipulated, that something outside her control had led to her actions. But as the investigation unfolded and the truth was revealed, Devrin's heart broke. Alyssa had been involved in a calculated plan, and the woman he had once trusted with everything had become part of a fraud scheme. The discovery of her body, strangled, discarded, and alone was a cruel and final blow to everything Devrin had known. Despite the painful truth, Devrin continued to work with the police, providing detailed insights into Alyssa's character. He painted a picture of a woman who, for most of their time together, had been kind, hardworking, and dedicated. Devrin refused to let the image of the woman who had betrayed him overshadow the person he had loved for so many years. He spoke about her as someone who had struggled with the situation, expressing doubt and fear in her messages and drafts. He couldn't help but feel that, while Alyssa had made a grave mistake, she was ultimately a victim in her own way, caught up in the web of Remel Jenkins' manipulation. The sense of betrayal weighed heavily on Devrin. He initially believed that Alyssa's disappearance was a cry for help, a way to escape the pressure of their shared life. The idea that she had changed her mind and wanted to return to him only made her death feel more unjust. "She didn't deserve to die for changing her mind," he said in an interview, his voice breaking with emotion. It was clear that Devrin's pain came not only from losing Alyssa but from the overwhelming sense of helplessness he felt in realizing that he had been unable to save her. Alyssa's struggle, caught between fear and coercion, ultimately cost her life, and Devrin had to reconcile with the fact that his last image of her, the one he had clung to in his heart, was no longer the truth. Devrin was left grappling with the tragic irony of the situation. The dream they had built together, the future they had planned, had been taken away not by some unforeseen tragedy, but by the betrayal of someone she had trusted. a family member who should have protected her. In his grief, Devrin was also forced to accept the reality of how deeply manipulation and control had impacted Alyssa's decision-making. The woman he had loved had been a victim of circumstances much larger than the two of them, and the pain of that truth would never leave him. While Devrin was left to process his heartbreak and confusion, the hunt for Remel Jenkins intensified. The manhunt for Jenkins took on a national scope as law enforcement pieced together his movements after Alyssa's murder. Jenkins, who had been living under multiple false identities, managed to evade capture for weeks. He had a long history of criminal activity, and his ability to manipulate systems and disappear was well documented. Using different names and fraudulent documentation, Jenkins moved from state to state, always staying one step ahead of the law. Despite his best efforts to remain undetected, Jenkins made one fatal mistake. He was tracked down in Texas, where he was found hiding under a new identity. Law enforcement, having traced his whereabouts through the use of bank records, surveillance footage, and his fraudulent activities, arrested him without incident. When Jenkins was apprehended, he had no choice but to admit his involvement in the murder. He confessed to strangling Alyssa after a violent argument, but his confession didn't come without further manipulation. Jenkins tried to downplay his role in the crime, insisting that Alyssa had gotten cold feet, and that she had been trying to back out of the plan. His version of events didn't sit well with investigators, and it became clear that his manipulation of Alyssa had been a constant throughout their relationship. Jenkins was charged with first-degree murder, financial fraud, and identity theft. The trial that followed was a tense and emotional one for everyone involved. The prosecution laid out the devastating evidence: Alyssa's premeditated plan to take the money, her eventual doubts, and her tragic end. The defense, attempting to argue that Jenkins was somehow less culpable due to Alyssa's apparent willingness to participate in the fraud, failed to convince the jury. They could see through the layers of deceit and manipulation. Jenkins, despite his attempt to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, was undeniably the driving force behind the events that led to Alyssa's death. As the trial concluded, the jury found Remel Jenkins guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Devrin, the verdict didn't bring closure. No sentence could bring Alyssa back, no measure of justice could undo the hurt he had endured. But in a way, it allowed him to move forward with the painful knowledge that the man responsible for her death would never walk free again. Devrin, though devastated, made a promise to himself. He would continue to share Alyssa's story, to ensure that her memory wasn't defined solely by the tragedy of her death. He remembered the woman she had been, the person he had fallen in love with, and he vowed that her legacy would be remembered for more than just the final chapter of manipulation and betrayal. The story of Alyssa Harmon's disappearance, financial manipulation, and eventual death is one that leaves us grappling with a powerful mix of emotions: betrayal, heartbreak, and a sobering realization of how far someone can be pushed into dangerous territory. Alyssa, a young woman who had worked tirelessly with her partner, Devrin, to create a better future, ultimately fell victim to the manipulation of someone who should have been a protector: her uncle, Remel Jenkins. What started as a desire to build a new life in Austin became a nightmare that led to a tragic, untimely death. This case serves as a tragic example of how trust, when exploited, can lead to devastating consequences. Alyssa's relationship with Jenkins, complicated by years of familial ties, left her vulnerable. He preyed on her willingness to trust, manipulating her into a situation she had doubts about but ultimately went through with, driven by fear, guilt, and a desire to escape her reality. Her trust was betrayed in the most horrific way, and the very person she turned to for guidance turned out to be the one responsible for her death. The financial aspects of the crime, fraudulent withdrawals and false identities, highlight how quickly someone can exploit their position in someone's life. Jenkins knew how to manipulate systems, and sadly, he used his expertise not only to steal money but also to strip away any chance Alyssa had for a happy, peaceful future. In the end, this was not just a crime of financial theft, it was a crime of control, a crime of breaking someone down emotionally until they felt they had no other choice but to go along with a dangerous plan. As we reflect on this case, it's a harsh reminder of the vulnerabilities that young adults, especially in toxic or manipulative relationships, can face. Familial ties are often seen as bonds of unconditional love and support, but as we saw here, that trust can be easily weaponized against them. For Alyssa, the decision to trust her uncle, combined with his criminal past, led her down a path that ultimately ended in her death. This case should serve as a cautionary tale to recognize manipulative behavior in our relationships and the dangers of misplaced trust, especially when individuals with their own hidden motives use that trust for their gain. For Devrin Brooks, the emotional aftermath of Alyssa's death will never fully fade. He spent months in a state of confusion, fear, and disbelief, believing that his partner had simply left him. But when the truth was revealed that Alyssa had been both a victim and a perpetrator, it only deepened his sense of loss and betrayal. The man who had planned a future with her, who had sacrificed so much to create a life together, was left to cope with the tragic consequences of a relationship that had been built on manipulation. In interviews and public statements, Devrin admitted that the hardest part of it all was the realization that he was unable to save Alyssa from the choices she made, even though he loved her. He had hoped that the woman he once knew, who had been full of hope and determination, could be found again. But that Alyssa was gone, replaced by someone who was too far entangled in the web of deceit to find her way back. The pain of betrayal mixed with the grief of losing someone he had once trusted with everything he had. Devrin has now become an advocate for recognizing the subtle signs of manipulation, not just in romantic relationships, but in familial dynamics as well. His message is clear. No one should have to live in fear, especially when it comes to the people they love most. He urges others to recognize the signs of coercion and manipulation before it's too late, hoping that Alyssa's tragic fate will bring awareness to how vulnerable young adults can be, even when they are surrounded by people they trust. Now that you've heard Alyssa's story, it's time for you to reflect. What would you have done in Devrin's shoes? How would you react if someone you loved and trusted betrayed you in such a way? Let us know in the comments that if you found this story impactful. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime and storytelling content. Your support helps us bring more awareness to the stories that matter.